Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you all here joining us today for this, what promised to be a super exciting webinar. Today's webinar is going to be about the central question of how countries can retain and preserve debt sustainability while financing for development. Before diving into the key topic of today's webinar, let me briefly introduce myself and also the International Institute for Sustainable Development. My name is Anahí Wiedenbrüg. I lead the IISD's Sovereign Debt Program, which is part of IISD's Tax and Debt Program. And we are very excited to be hosting you today. As I just said, the International Institute is a think and do tank, which essentially entails that we don't only do applied research, but that we also do technical assistance on the ground, and we convene spaces such as this one in order to be able to share our findings as well. At IISD, we think that part of the answer to the central question of how countries can retain and preserve debt sustainability has to do with fiscal frameworks, with robust fiscal frameworks, and that it is vital to strengthen these. And we have particular interest, and this is the topic of today's webinar, on fiscal rules and fiscal institutions. We think that they're key to enhance transparency and liquidity, to anchor investor expectations, and to really try to marry something which is difficult to sustain at the same time, which is on the one hand flexibility to respond to shocks and prioritize development, while at the same time, of course, also kind of retaining trust in the country's debt trajectory. It is vital that these things come together so that fiscal rules and fiscal institutions support each other. Debt rules, which is the key topic of today's conversation, alone can sometimes backfire. In the case of a perceived upside, for instance, when a debt ceiling has not yet been reached, officials may feel secure and neglect other vulnerabilities that not necessarily come from the fiscal sector, such as, for instance, external imbalances. And in the downside, it is possible that despite a debt level being breached, fundamentals still remaining sound, and investors nonetheless reacting preventively to the debt ceiling being breached. So that is why we think that institutions are absolutely of the essence to kind of combine with fiscal rules, to work with fiscal rules in order to truly build these robust fiscal frameworks. Today, we're very fortunate that we have an excellent panel of speakers. First, we're going to hear from Fernando Morra, who is associate at IISD and who's the former Vice Minister of Economy of Argentina. And he will be presenting the key findings of our report, Design Choices for Debt Sustainability. Then we have the privilege of having Monica de Bolle, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and former IMF economist too, who will be commenting as the first speaker on Fernando's presentation. Then we have Mohammed Amin Adam, who's current member of parliament in Ghana and former Minister of Finance there as well. And last but definitely not least, we will be hearing from Jeromin Zettelmeyer, Director at Bruegel and former IMF Deputy Director of the IMF Strategy, Policy and Review Department. I also want to flag from the get-go that you have a chat box for questions and answers that you can see there. Please feel free to start kind of populating it with questions, raise your questions there, and we'll make sure to open the floor after our excellent speakers have had an opportunity to comment as well. And we're very much looking forward to a lively discussion. So without much further ado, I'll pass over the floor to you, Fernando. Please feel free to share your presentation, share your screen, and talk us through the main findings of the report.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks, Annie. This is not my presentation, it's the presentation of the whole team of IISD, both based on the report that we recently published, both with Yane and with Anahí, that are part of the team. Can you see the presentation now? Yes, it's okay. Okay. So, well, for it's a pleasure to have this distinguished speakers, and so I will go directly to the point because we don't have so much time, and what we are looking for is basically the discussion after the presentation. So let me start by trying to outlining the main objective of the report we are presenting. The question was, how can countries maintain debt sustainability while financing development? Let me put that in a different tone. How to guide fiscal policy and this is the idea, to gain flexibility and at the same time retain credibility. So the most common answer as an intertemporal guide for fiscal policy, I mean, for trying to see which kind of deficit you should have at every point in time and which debt levels, the most common answer for credibility question was fiscal rules, and particularly debt rules. The problem that we're seeing, that we're trying to figure it out, is that most of the rules often lack flexibility. And in a world that is increasingly volatile, and when there is growing development needs and there is needs for investment, for transforming the productive matrix, that rigidity can be problematic. So what did we do? Our first chance was to try to figure it out if design choices alone can resolve this problem, can try to bring a solution for this, for bringing more flexibility to the rules. And let me anticipate our main conclusion, that it's no, it's not the case. It is problematic. In the second section, I will try to explain why do we think that, and to give a more deep answer to that question. And in the third part, I will try to give a different approach on what we think that it's better for countries. So what we did at the beginning, we said, okay, let's try to look at, we collect and analyze more than 86 design choices among countries using the database, basically of the IMF database. We divide countries into the usual categories: debt ceilings, debt anchors, that are basically numerical rules; debt ceiling meaning rules that are basically mechanic; debt anchors who are basically rules that tells you how much should be the debt in the medium term, or which kind of ceiling do you have, but in the medium term, it's a target. And debt standards that are more qualitative prescriptions. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but we did the job to try to figure it out, to try to look at every different design choices in many countries. So, and these are the kind of different things that we look like. And that most of the rules differs on several details, whether the rules are national or supranational, escape clauses, debt perimeter, so on and so forth. And that helps us to give us a broad view of choices. But even when there are many configurations, in our view, they all face the same trade-off. That it's, if you have a lower credibility, the lower the credibility, the higher the need for rigidity. And unfortunately, and I mean, this is a problem mostly for low-income countries, because these kind of countries are the countries who has lower level of credibility and therefore are more likely to adopt a more rigid fiscal rules. And let me give you some examples, and I have three here. Colombia has a debt ceiling of 70% since 2011, I think, of 70% of the GDP, is quite rigid, and they have a reference of 55% of the GDP who triggers a higher level of primary surplus. Another example, it's Ghana, that it's now in a post-restructuring process that has adopted this year, and Mohammed knows a lot about this, and we hope to have their comments around this, a debt anchor. And on the other side of the world, New Zealand has a debt standard since the beginning of the 90s. So why I bring these three examples here? Because it's interesting that the most flexible and credible approach, it's in New Zealand. So the point here that we want to stress is that credibility allows you to avoid rigid rules, but it doesn't work the other way around. Fiscal rules or rigid rules, we don't think that necessarily build credibility. And I will try to explain why. So this is the second part of the presentation, to try to think why the fiscal rule, some rigid fiscal rule alone can give you credibility. And the first is our first step was to just revise, to say again the very well-known trilemma of stressed by De Bruin and Jonung, that there is a trilemma between simplicity, flexibility, and enforceability. So it's very hard for our initial question. It's very hard for countries to have a more flexible rule without affecting either or any of both simplicity or enforcement. The problem is that if you want, and this is the problem of lower income countries. Lower income countries said, okay, I don't have credibility, so I will try to have a more simple and enforceable rule in order to build it. But the problem that we see is that you are basically sacrificing flexibility and you are not necessarily retaining credibility. And why is that? We think that there is at least two another problems of the rules-based approach. One of them is that rules don't, and this is kind of complex, so I will try to explain it in some detail. At least what we think about this. Rules have this kind of problem, doesn't perform very well under uncertainty, and it gives the wrong kind of signals. We think that it gives the wrong kind of signals to policy, both policy and capital flows. So we all know that capital flows are procyclical. So let me tell you two different stories. One in which a country, a lower or middle income country, has a capital inflows. Then capital inflows appreciate the exchange rate. You have a stronger demand because imports are cheaper. You have a higher revenues of the public sector. So and you have lower cost of capital. So you have more revenues, you have lower cost of capitals, you have lower debt levels because GDP is higher and the real exchange rate appreciates. So all the signals point into a softer fiscal constraints, and you have more capital inflows. So the problem on the upside is that you're taking excessive risk. You're not looking that maybe you will have an external shock. You will need to depreciate the exchange rate, or you are taking too much debt. On the downside, if you have capital outflows, you have the opposite. You have capital outflows, then you have problems with the real exchange, the nominal exchange rate, but you have basically problems with a depreciation of the exchange rate. The demand is weaker, the levels of the GDP are higher, so there is a jump on the debt to GDP levels, and then the rule asks you to have a fiscal response when basically you have a recession and you have a capital outflow. So the problem is that in that cases, maybe it's too late, and that policies are hard to define, are hard to discuss with the society. So in the downside, we think that these kind of rules reinforce the negative feedback loops of procyclicality of capital flows. And the third problem, and let me give you an example of this, and I forget that I have this slide. Let me give you an example of this, that it's kind of quite of interesting. Colombia's debt rule has this kind of, they call it ancla fiscal, that it's not an anchor, it's like a trigger. If the debt surpasses 55% of the GDP, of debt to GDP, then you need to activate fiscal corrective policy measures. So this happens in the middle of the pandemic. The government said, okay, look, this is the pandemic. We cannot make corrective fiscal measures. So they activate the escape clause. But the market basically punished Colombia, even more other countries of the region that were basically much more or less in the same situation, like Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay. You can see it on the spread of the sovereign bonds there. And more interesting, this is not something that it's only related to one administration, because you can say, okay, this is a problem of Petro government, let's say. I don't want to discuss this now, but it's interesting because this started in the previous administration, not necessarily in this. And it keep in that way, mostly because the signal is that you activated the trigger and you're not necessarily responding. But of course, you are in the moment when there is capital outflows and you need, and it's exactly the moment when you need more the fiscal policy to be active. So this is the kind of things that we are looking as a problematic thing of the rules-based approach. The third thing is it's a little bit more complex and more technical, but I will try to explain it as easy as possible. And it's a problem of implementation. That debt is a medium-term target. So to link it with something that you're doing now, with a current policy, you need to pair it basically, and this is very common, very usual, with a budget balance rule or a spending rule, but I'm not going to talk about that. So the problem there is that that leads to overdeterminacy. What you have there, the small equation, is the debt stabilizing primary balances. For each debt target, you have only one debt stabilizing primary balance, but it depends on both the refinancing cost and the growth rates. Both of them are basically uncertain. So unless you're very lucky, the two rules start to be in conflict all the time. And the common answer to that is that the common answer of international financial institutions is that you should use buffers to avoid being very close to the debt limits. But the problem again is that debt buffers affect investment. So the problem here is that in the implementation process of a simple and enforceable fiscal rules, you will have this kind of contradiction. And if you want to avoid it, you will affect investment. So you will not have flexibility anyway. So with all this discussing, what's the alternative? We think, and we are basically proposing, that we should move from the idea, we should move the prescription that we're making to the lower income countries, low and middle income countries, to move from rigid fiscal rules to a constrained discretion framework. I know this is hard, but I think that we think that if we can move from the idea of enforcement to accountability, we can retain flexibility and we can basically have at the same time a simple and a framework that points into the direction of that sustainability. The most, and this is very long, but I will try to say it as simple as possible. We think that the most appropriate setup is try to embed debt anchors. Let's say the country should have a target for which are the debt levels that are sustainable, but each government should have a decision on that it should be accountable and transparent. And there is a role for independent institutions there, but not necessarily as a rule enforcer, but as a communicator of fiscal risks. And looking at debt dynamics and to try to reinforce the accountability of countries' policies. I had a discussion recently on, okay, this is going to be problematic in lower income countries because, okay, if the country doesn't want to align policies with debt sustainability, this kind of framework is not going to say anything to this kind of governments. I kind of agree, and this is an opinion, and this is not something that I discussed with Annie and Jane, but I kind of agree that there is nothing, it is difficult. If country doesn't care about sustainability, no rule will help them. But the point is that for countries that do want to have a sustainable policy, this approach can better guide decision more effectively. That's our idea. And let me finalize with just one example. That it's I talk about Colombia. The second one is Ghana. Ghana recently put a set of fiscal rules. One of them is a debt anchor of something like 40. I can't remember now, but I guess it's 43% of the GDP in 2034. As you can see in the graph, the debt has been in a lower, in a descending trend, and we think, and this is our projection, it's going to be kind of very close to the target even in 2025. Why is that? Because the country has benefited both from the debt restructuring, that lower interest rates, and a growth, a high growth level, and appreciation of the real exchange rate, mostly because of the increasing price of gold. So debt anchor seems to be feasible to achieve. But if you look at the fiscal primary balance, never in the last 50 years that we have data, never in the history, Ghana has a primary balance of 1.5% of the GDP. So our question was, at some point, what happens if the country has a descending trend of the debt to GDP but doesn't meet the target of primary balance? That it could happen. So the other part of the new bill of Ghana was the inclusion of a fiscal council. They are trying to set a fiscal council. So we are basically saying that we are advising them. We are using this idea to say, okay, instead of trying to have a fiscal council that only has a role of as a watchdog of the fiscal rule, this institution should better explain fiscal risk to the general public and the dynamics of the debts also. So we are basically trying to use this general idea to try to have a practical example in real life, let's say. So in summary, I will finalize with this. We think that the smart rules is not enough. We think that as a general guide, we need to move from rigid fiscal rules as a prescription to a constrained discretion fiscal framework regime, let's say, and that for that we will need institutions that preserve credibility, protecting accountability and transparency, and mostly have enough judgment to assess fiscal risk for policy decisions that are going to basically be sovereign all the time. So let me end there. Thanks again, everyone, for being here today, and I'm very eager to have the discussion with the rest of you. Thank you very much.
So much, Fer. That was absolutely excellent. I think kind of the main points were kind of super clearly communicated. I really liked how you expressed the idea that even if you choose to sacrifice flexibility in kind of the name of enforcement and simplicity, that won't necessarily give you credibility. And also that although credibility may exist in a context of strict numerical fiscal rules, the causality doesn't work the other way around. So kind of strict numerical targets do not necessarily give you credibility, which is kind of part of what you're searching for, right? And of course, as you stressed, the very important role of an independent fiscal council in communicating the implications that fiscal and maybe also monetary policy decisions have on the country's debt trajectory. So thank you very much for that. Monica, it is now an absolute privilege to have you here and get your input on this. We are kind of very keen to hear a little bit more about your recent work on economic nationalism and how debt rules interact with sovereignty, security, development, and other kind of sovereign goals. If there's a limit to the extent of which debt rules and fiscal frameworks can kind of create tensions with these other national kind of sovereign priorities. And then, of course, as well, whether today fiscal rules are flexible enough for countries facing multiple crises. So I'll pass on the floor to you.
Thank you, Anahí, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to your colleagues, for inviting me to participate in this very interesting discussion on an extremely timely topic, especially for everybody, but I am speaking now specifically of my country, where I come from, Brazil, where this has been an active discussion for years. And in fact, Brazil has a very interesting experience, which I'll talk about in a moment. But to your first point and to your first question, yes, fiscal and very rigid fiscal rules of whatever kind they are, whether they be debt rules or spending rules or some other kind of cap on spending, they usually do come into conflict with broader development goals and broader sort of, as we're seeing now, all of these discussions around industrial policy and how it is contained within this agenda of nationalist leaning or economic nationalist leaning economic policies. We definitely do see, the very clearly the kinds of constraints that are imposed when you try to do these sorts of policies, industrial policies, and at the same time have these fairly rigid fiscal frameworks. They do come into conflict. And when that happens, it's a problem, especially in our current environment where everything is mired by political ideology and political polarization. So the political economy aspect of these things cannot be overstated. It's huge, and it plays a massive role. So let me give the example of Brazil, which I think helps to illustrate a lot of these political economy issues, which can be very difficult to overcome. Thinking about the constrained discretion aspect of the presentation and of the report, this was very much the spirit of Brazil's fiscal responsibility law, which was enacted in the early 2000s. So if we go back to that, which is, over 20 years ago, the way that a lot of people in Brazil were thinking about these issues resonates a lot with what you are presenting today and what you are proposing today. That fiscal responsibility law did have a sort of constrained discretion regime built into it. The problem is, as you've also highlighted, that given that the country, Brazil, had never had a really good track record in terms of fiscal trajectories and debt trajectories in its past, the constrained discretion approach was viewed with some suspicion, and people thought that, okay, great, we have this fiscal responsibility law, but we need to be a bit more rigid in the way we do things because Brazil doesn't have a very good track record in fulfilling its own promises with respect to fiscal deliverables, let's put it that way. And so, it was a debate that took years and years and years to get through. And then finally, when we came to 2016, when Brazil was really having a lot of difficulties on the fiscal front and there were corruption scandals everywhere, the economy was doing very badly, and it looked as if the country was going to dive into another fiscal crisis, that was averted by a very, very rigid regime that was put in place through a spending cap. So it's different from the debt rule, from the focus you have, but it speaks directly to the debt rule because at the time it was perceived that, okay, we need this spending cap in order to signal to markets and to market participants and to the population at large that we are very serious about debt sustainability. So the spending cap was used to make a point about, debt sustainability. The problem is that going to the trilemma, which I think is a great way to sort of place this discussion, Brazil did err on the side of making a spending cap that was very simple, but at the same time, it was extremely rigid, and especially because of what was done with it. Brazil's spending cap was put into Brazil's constitution as a constitutional amendment, which meant that in order to change it, or so the thinking went at the time, it's going to be very hard to change this spending cap. It's going to be very hard for governments to fiddle around with this, because if we put it in the Constitution, then it's going to take a majority, a supermajority in Congress to change this thing, and it's going to be very difficult for the government to be doing this on a consistent basis. Thus, putting the spending cap in the Constitution was seen as the resolution to potential, temptations that the government might have in the future to change the spending cap, or to make the spending cap more favorable to itself, therefore compromising debt sustainability. What was not adequately taken into account was the political economy side of this, because when you do it like that, and you have a fiscal rule that is simple and rigid, and it's in the Constitution, you lose any side of flexibility. And in a country like Brazil, or like any middle-income country, or these days like any country for that matter, that is consistently buffeted by shocks, many of which are not of the country's own making, the pandemic comes to mind, you do need to have this kind of flexibility, because otherwise what do? You can't accommodate things. What happened in the Brazilian case was that between 2019 and 2022, in part because of the pandemic, but not only, Brazil's spending cap had to be changed 5 times. And in those 5 instances, because it was a constitutional amendment that needed all of these negotiations with Congress in order for it to come through, in the usual sort of quid pro quo that goes on between the executive and the legislative, it turned out that the executive branch, in order to get what it needed to flexibilize the spending cap, had to hand over power to Congress. And so now Brazil has a situation where these powers are completely unbalanced, because at the end of the day, through these many, many constitutional amendments, changes in constitutional amendments that were done, Congress effectively now has the ability to hold the executive branch hostage whenever there is a fiscal policy or fiscal measure, or any kind of measure for that matter, that they don't agree with. And that is precisely the conundrum that's in the country right now. Brazil does need some fiscal adjustments. Brazil needs to cut spending significantly. It does need to have a tax reform, but guess what? It won't be done, because Congress, which has a composition right now that is uniquely self-interested, even when we look at Brazilian history, is in a situation where they basically get from the government what they want, because they de facto hold the purse strings, both in the short term and the medium term. So we've fallen into this political economy black hole that no one knows what to do with that, because once you've handed over power to the legislative branch in this manner, you can't really get it back. And that puts you in a bind when it comes to adjusting fiscal going forward. So I think, this case sort of illustrates a lot of the points that you're bringing up in the presentation and in the report, in which I think helps inform precisely this discussion about flexibility. Flexibility is key. Yes, enforcement is also key, but we need to really get this balance right, because if we get it wrong, then a country can face a situation like Brazil's for a very long time. So I'll leave my initial comments there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. That's fascinating. It really illustrates how a spending cap like Brazil's kind of has implications that go way beyond kind of fiscal policy, the fiscal policy regime. And I love the expression political economy black hole. Well, in a nutshell, essentially, kind of the strict spending cap has created a political economy black hole. So yeah, fascinating, and very keen to kind of hear also kind of the audience's reaction to this kind of case study. I wanted to remind all of you that there is a kind of Q&A chat box where you can ask questions as we go along, and we can then post them to the speakers and to Fernando. But before we do that, we still have 2 kind of wonderful speakers to go. Amin, I'd like to pass on the floor to you now. We're of course super keen to hear about Ghana's experience, the practical challenges that you're facing in implementing at the same time a budget balance rule and a debt rule, what lessons lie in that experience for other countries undergoing a similar process, operationalizing fiscal rules and debt rules specifically. And of course, we're also particularly keen to hear about the implementation of the Fiscal Council and how you envision the role of the Fiscal Council going forward in Ghana. Amin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I first of all want to comment on the presentation. First of all, I agree that unconstrained discretion in fiscal policy can prove dangerous for countries, especially for developing countries. But when you have to set up rules, whether rigid or flexible, should be guided by the conditions that predate the development of the fiscal rules. For developing countries where there are no strong institutions, the temptation to favor rigid fiscal rules are very high, because you want to ensure that people do not violate the rules and get away with them. And so you may need rigid fiscal rules where institutions are weak. However, when institutions are developed and they become stronger, then flexible rules could work. I mean, if you take the example of Norway, they set up their fiscal rule after they had built their institutions. And their fiscal rule was not a product of a legislation. It was a bipartisan consensus. It wasn't legislated. And so such a rule could work even without any legislation where institutions are stronger. But for developing countries, I mean, you really can be sure that where the institutions are not working, and if they are there, they are very weak, it's going to be very difficult to allow for flexibility, especially because the triggers of flexibility could be auctioned. A government can create the condition that allows it to apply the escape clauses and endanger the fiscals of the country. And so I don't know where I stand between rigid or flexible rule, but one condition I think need to be met to take a departure from rigid to flexible rule is the development of strong institutions. I've also looked at the debt dynamics, your analysis of the debt dynamics in the presentation, in particular, the formula, the equation for debt accumulation, which focuses on two effects, the snowball effect and also the primary balance effect. But an important effect, which is not reflected in the equation, is what we call the deficit debt adjustment effect. And this relates to usually the financial support the government provides to the financial sector during crisis. And that was, particularly the case of Ghana, where government had to do bailouts, government had to do recapitalization, government had to do guarantees. But these are usually not reflected in the primary balance. And therefore, it will be good to have that component reflected in the analysis of debt dynamics. Same as debt restructuring. For example, if you have debt relief, it could affect your debt to GDP. And therefore, for Ghana, as a context, the equation for debt accumulation you provided may not apply. And so you may have to look at that in order to make it more applicable to Ghana. The significant reduction in our debt to GDP ratio is as a result of the debt relief that we got. Not only in terms of interest rates going down, but also in terms of outright cancellation of up to $5 billion of Ghana's debt stock. The third issue I'd like to talk about is whether you can have both debt rules and budget balance rules, as Ghana has done recently in our law. What I see about the primary balance rule is effectively a debt rule. And so it becomes difficult for me to understand why you will have a debt rule in addition to a primary balance rule, which has a very high target. 1.5% surplus is a very high target. And based on your analysis of the debt dynamics, the equation you showed indicates that when you have higher primary surplus, your debt to GDP reduces. And so if you have a primary surplus rule, I don't see why you should have, in addition to that, a debt rule. And this is why I agree with the presenter that you may achieve the debt rule in the case of Ghana very soon. We are targeting 2034 to achieve a debt to GDP of 45. We may achieve that even earlier than 2034, but you cannot guarantee that your primary fiscal balance on commitment will stay at 1.5% as prescribed in the legislation. And so the emphasis should be on the primary fiscal balance, which in effect will also have a significant effect on the debt stock of the country. So having said that, let me look at a few challenges, practical challenges that Ghana has faced in implementing fiscal rules. So one of the major challenges is the revenue mobilization. Our revenue mobilization drive has been challenging to the extent that we are not able to collect what legitimately a government should be collecting from taxpayers. I can give you, for example, VAT, where we are doing below 50% of its potential. But there is always a temptation for governments to think that they can raise taxes to finance public expenditure, what we call in the literature fiscal illusion, or what your presenter described as deficit bias. But this is mostly not sustainable. I mean, in most cases, not sustainable, because it gets to a point where the citizens will rise up against you. It gets to a point where people will find intelligent schemes of avoiding taxes. And so what I think is relevant in such a situation is how to improve debt collection, tax collection, so that you can maximize the tax handles that you have rather than resorting to fiscal illusion or deficit bias approaches. The second challenge that we have faced, is the type of financing conditions you are exposed to. Whether external financing or domestic financing, the conditions will determine which one you should emphasize. If you decide to go external financing, you should know by now that there are no cheap, financing out there. The cheaper financing coming from the development financial institutions, what we call concessional facilities, are difficult to come by. Negotiating them is very costly because it delays, and also disbursement also delays. But you cannot have cheaper financing than what the development financial institutions are giving. And so you may want to resort to domestic financing, which many people say is cheaper. But there's a trade-off to that as well. Because if you increase domestic financing, you compromise growth because the private sector will be crowded out. And so it depends on the financing conditions you are exposed to, and that will determine whether you borrow at cheaper cost or you borrow at higher cost, which will have effect on your debt to GDP. Another factor, which is peculiar in Ghana also, is the presence of the central bank on the market. If you want to do domestic financing and the central bank is on the market, you compete for the money out there. The central bank through its bills are going for the same money the Ministry of Finance is going for. And so a lack of coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy could also affect your financing and thereby affect your rules, your spending rules. For example, the government has done 37 auctions, treasury auctions, and out of the 37, 18 have failed. As of the end of September, 18 have failed with a bid cover ratio below 1. And this is largely because the central bank is on the market offering higher interest for its bills, at the expense of the government. And so if government is not able to raise the revenue, either through taxes or financing to meet its budget requirement, then there is no way you can meet your rules, whether you are talking about budget balance rules or you're talking about debt rules. Then you also can see how off-budgetary spending can affect the implementation of your rules. By off-budgetary spending, usually arising from political pressure, and usually during crisis, you resort to spending that you don't even have the money to do, and so your borrowing is going to increase. So these are some of the challenges that we have faced in implementing our rules. Let me also talk about the issue of arrears accumulation. Arrears accumulation is the reason the primary fiscal balance rule is important. But there are times ministries and departments will commit the government without the Ministry of Finance even knowing about that. Usually the Ministry of Finance will provide what we call commencement certificate or clearance for activities or projects or commitments that are not in the budget, right? But where ministries and departments and agencies can commit government to projects without clearing with the finance ministry, when discovered, they could, drill your fiscals and thereby lead to violation in your rules. The fiscal slippage that we had in Ghana by the end of 2024, about 3% of GDP, was as a result of this. The minister asked MDAs to bring, a list of their commitment, and they brought a long list of commitment, that was captured in the arrears without auditing. Later audit showed, preliminary findings from the audit shows that most of them could not be justified and they have been rejected. So if you go to look at the figure today in terms of the fiscal slip, it is not 3% of GDP any longer. It is much lower than that because significant amount of the list that was provided in terms of commitments, have been rejected by the audit. And so when such a situation happens, it can drill the implementation of your rules. But this brings us to the issue of strong institutions. Where there are strong institutions, the very ministries and departments which are committing government should not do that. We have sanctions in our Public Financial Management Act. The sanctions have not been applied. So rather than government applying the sanctions and punishing the people responsible for this commitment, we chose to rather bring them into the computation of our arrears and thereby drilling our fiscal numbers, which you describe as fiscal slip. So these are the challenges that we face. In terms of lessons, I think that there are so many lessons Ghana can share with other countries. The fact that budgetary pressures need to be managed and managed well, even during times of crisis, is an important lesson for every country. I mean, Ghana has had to go through such a painful debt restructuring as a result of higher debt to GDP. The DDEP was very painful. I mean, and Ghanaians did not take lightly the impact of the DDEP. Then also the loss of international capital market. I mean, when your debt GDP is very high, you cannot go out there and get funding, and also uncompleted projects. Many projects have had to be left uncompleted because you do not have access to the capital market, you do not have access to external funding, and you are left only with domestic funding, and that may not suffice your budgetary requirement. Another lesson is that we need simple but effective rules backed by strong institutions, which I alluded to earlier. So these are, in my view, some of the lessons that we need to learn. And the need to have strong institutions, underscores the new fiscal council that Ghana is seeking to establish by law. And we all have to do what we can to ensure that this fiscal council works and works effectively to ensure that we bring integrity to our fiscal rules.
Thanks so much. I mean, that was incredibly rich. It's hard for me to kind of pick on kind of one or two comments because I think there is truly a lot of lessons to be learned, both from the challenges and also how you faced it. I'd be very keen to hear a little bit more about the Fiscal Council, but I think I'll leave it for the Q&A session. Let me just flag that I thought it was very interesting how you kind of laid the ground as well by saying that countries that do not have an established credibility with credible institutions might be more tempted, or that is what I understood you to say, to have kind of strict numerical targets. I think that really kind of mirrors some of the initial kind of comments that Fernando also made in terms of, kind of seeing how New Zealand is in a way kind of has very flexible fiscal rules at debt standard, despite having credibility, or it has credibility despite not having kind of very strict numerical rules, and this looking different in emerging markets and developing economies. Also super interesting to kind of hear you speak about, the potential effect that, say, not meeting primary surplus can have on the debt rule and the debt trajectory. I think this is something that is also very close to kind of the research we've done, and very happy to have you pick up on that specifically. Jeromin, I want to pass on the floor to you now. We're very keen to hear more about how you interpret kind of the necessary evolution of fiscal frameworks to be able to kind of re-win certain flexibility in the context of heightened volatility in the global economic environment. And we'd also be very, very interested particularly to hear more about the changes that we've seen in the EU's fiscal policy regime, moving from an ad hoc quantitative fiscal rules to an approach based on debt sustainability, essentially creating a new fiscal framework in April of 2024. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about how that's going and what the lessons are that you're drawing from that experience up until today. Thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anahí. It's a pleasure to be here. I greatly enjoyed the other presentations and particularly enjoyed Monica's description of how rigidity can backfire, not only in an economic policy sense, but in a deep constitutional sense. I mean, upsetting the separation of powers, that was really an extraordinary story. Okay, so, I guess we are sort of philosophically all pretty close. So we all think institutions are important and we're all sort of on the flexible side. Maybe, I mean, a little less than the others, but we are all more or less in this camp. And so I basically sympathize a lot with your paper, Fernando and Anahí. So the way I read your paper is that you're saying that we should aim somewhere in the middle between standard quantitative rules and qualitative standards, and you call this constrained discretion, and I agree with that. So I also try to aim in that middle. So I call it standards, but mostly because the concepts are defined with words, but it doesn't mean that in the end you don't use quantitative analysis, right? You have to use you have to crunch the numbers, and then in the end you probably may come up with quantitative operational targets. So that's what we more or less did in Europe. And now your second main point, which I also very much agree with, is that for this sort of constrained discretion to work, we need an effective accountability framework where an independent fiscal institution plays a key role, not by dictating fiscal policy, obviously, but essentially as a whistleblower that interprets whether the government is following the standard or respecting the constraints or not. And by the way, to some extent, the independent fiscal council, if it's good, it solves one of the dilemmas of the De Bruegel triangle, which is the simplicity stuff, right? Because you can express principles of an economic framework very simply, so it will be properly understood. But then in order to implement it, you may need sophisticated methods, and you shouldn't shy away from this. And so the job of the fiscal council is in effect to translate this to the general public. Okay, so let me give my views in 4 points on how you want to set up such a system with a constrained discretion and where the limits are at the end. So the way I would describe the trade-off is a bit more simple than the triangle. I only really care about one trade-off, which is between commitment ex ante and flexibility ex post. I think that pretty much sums it up. So the whole point about fiscal rules or standard is to create a commitment device that prevents governments from overspending and shifting political fiscal problems to the next government. If democracy were to work perfectly, even in an intergenerational sense, which it can never do, we wouldn't have these problems. So there is a policy failure that comes from the real deep workings of democracy, and fiscal rules are supposed to address this. But like any commitment device, they create a trade-off between commitment ex ante and flexibility ex post. So excessive flexibility is bad because it can be used to escape the commitment. And excessive rigidity is also bad because it creates economic costs and indeed political costs, like Monica said. And the economic costs are procyclicality. You constrain your fiscal response to shocks. You just tie your hands too much, and then you want to use them, you can't. And of course, importantly, also by forcing adjustment if one doesn't need it, right? So you may, it's all nice and well to say we need big fiscal buffers, but you also need other things in life, not just fiscal buffers, right? And so you need to have an efficient system that it doesn't put all the weight on fiscal probity. And so to ameliorate this trade-off, the design matters. And so I'm going to give you 4 design elements that partly overlap with what you said that I think are generally helpful. So the first principle is that I wouldn't legislate numerical debt or deficit targets normally, but I would use analysis, so essentially debt sustainability analysis, to determine the extent of required fiscal adjustment. And so that then can be complicated, but then, this is why you need fiscal councils. I'll come to that. I would give some flexibility in setting the adjustment period. So defining, the period over which you're supposed to adjust in light of some DSA requirement that says, if you want to stabilize your debt ratio, you need to reduce your deficits by 3 points of GDP. Now the question is, when do you do that? DSAs never tell you when to do it. They just tell you that you have to do it at some point. So how do you define the period over which this is required? Well, define it as the medium term or as a time interval, like 4 to 7 years, but don't be super rigid about this. Point 3, I think, setting an expenditure rule as an intermediate target is helpful because it avoids this procyclicality. So rather than targeting a deficit, you target, expenditure growth adjusted by structural revenues. And then if you hit a bad shock, you can let the deficit rip. And then the final point is to include well-defined escape clauses, which you also mentioned. Now, the main point I want to make with these 4 elements is that all of them require use of discretion. They don't work without discretion. And that also means that you need something else which prevents the abuse of discretion. Because, the underlying incentive problem of, over-consuming, running up debt too high is still there. And so for that, you need the independent fiscal institutions. And so these are experts that basically have to raise the red flag if governments are trying to cheat or abuse the rules. And they do that. Governments could do that through the way they conduct a DSA and taking unnecessarily long to adjust and coming up with rosy nominal growth projections so that they can claim that a particular expenditure growth path is consistent with required adjustment, which then may not be true. And then you end up with a deficit that's much too high. And of course, they could cheat by invoking escape clauses right and left. And so every time this happens, the fiscal council should raise a flag. Now, this might not be enough, right? So just raising the flag might not be enough. So in a sense, there's an assumption here that we have a functioning political system around this, right? But if you don't have that, you can't even start. Okay, then the final point is, that partly because there are all these multi-layers, assumptions and things that have to be jointly satisfied, we're not going to have a perfect system. Even a state-of-the-art system, and I think what I just described is close to the state-of-the-art, will struggle. And the objective should be to ensure that whatever system we have is better than feasible alternatives. So let me give you 2 examples from the EU experience over the last 12 to 18 months. And so the EU essentially implemented a system which, at least benevolently interpreted, is roughly the way I described. Right? There's some nonsense which I didn't go through, but benevolently interpreted, roughly we have this system. But there are 2 problems that have become apparent in the last 12 months. So the first is that, in spite of some efforts, our system doesn't effectively deal with a really important unintended consequence of fiscal adjustment, which is to distort the composition of spending in the direction of reducing public investment to avoid sort of more difficult structural reforms of the welfare state and so forth. And this is a big problem because by addressing one commitment problem, namely one that tries to favor or protect the benefit, the interests of future generations or future governments from the interests of those that are currently in power and currently vote, if you're not careful, you exacerbate a very similar commitment problem, which is that investment again tends to benefit the longer term, and so it is less attractive to current governments than consumptive spending. And so if you don't watch this, you're going to make this incentive problem worse. And we didn't do a good job in our current rules. You can, I think, design rules that give stronger protections to investment, and we, I have some ideas on how to do it, but no time to explain it. And then the other point, which became clear in the application of the EU framework, is this business about once you go with expenditure rules, it's really critical not to have overly optimistic nominal growth projections, right? Because otherwise you're pretending that a very generous expenditure path is going to give you the desired result. And so even when you have an ostensibly independent institution like the European Commission, you have a problem. You can see this problem. I'm writing about this. We will publish it probably next week with the latest German fiscal structural plan, which has wildly optimistic nominal growth assumptions, and basically the Commission has endorsed them. So I don't know what to do about this. You basically need multiple layers of institutions, civil society, think tanks. And maybe the Commission endorsed them to offset other problems, because again, the too rigid application of the system may not have been good either. So there are trade-offs everywhere. And then finally, let me make this point that the conceptually and practically hardest question remains to decide on the right time frame for adjustment. So theory tells you nothing there, right? Debt sustainability does not require adjustment now. If you write down sort of intertemporal budget constraints, they just tell you that over time, things have to add up. They don't tell you when you have to do the work. And so, the failure of adjustment, for example, in the US, which is currently the country, certainly the advanced country with the riskiest fiscal policy, to some extent reflects this problem. Right? So sure, everyone understands there's an adjustment, but markets have been very generous to the US government, and so you can always postpone it. The developing country couldn't get away with this. The US can up to a point. So how do you deal with this? So basically, instinctively, you would want to have a risk-based approach, not just to the extent of adjustment, which is where the emphasis is right now, right, through the DSA, but also on the speed of adjustment, on the time frame for adjustment. And this is not a problem that is being very well thought through. So it's not done in the EU framework, where this 4 to 7 year time period applies to everyone. And the result of that is that our framework may actually require too much adjustment, too fast adjustment from countries like Germany. And that then creates other problems, like essentially the Commission helping Germany get around the rules. So let me stop here.
I really have the problem as a moderator to kind of pick on kind of one or two of the things you said, because again, super rich intervention. Maybe to kind of already lay the ground for kind of the Q&A to come and the discussion to come. Let me maybe kind of add a comma to kind of what you said in terms of kind of the role of the Fiscal Council. You kind of called it a whistleblower and someone who, like an institution, that can raise the flag. I think that in our thinking, and this is partly reflected in the report, Design Choices for Debt Sustainability, that we just published, but is also going to be part of a kind of longer paper we're currently writing. The role of the Fiscal Council goes a little beyond that, or is even a little bit different, I would claim. So you kind of very much, highlight the importance, for instance, of a debt sustainability analysis that could guide better than kind of numerical targets, say. And what we think is that the Fiscal Council can really kind of bring back complexity in a way. You kind of simplified the trilemma to a kind of trade-off where you said commitment ex ante versus flexibility exposed. We still think that, of course, simplicity is kind of what simplicity brings to the table is precisely the problem that once rules become too complex, this can create kind of the wrong signals as well. So what the Fiscal Council can really do, and here the DSA, for instance, is of the essence, the Fiscal Council should be able to run a DSA and communicate clearly to the executive, legislative, citizens, and also to investors exactly what kind of the complexity of kind of real life and kind of real fiscal and monetary policy have on the country's trajectory. So to kind of say it in one punchline, I think for us, the Fiscal Council is not only a whistleblower, but essentially it's a technical, effective communicator that can explain how this complexity affects the debt trajectory, trying to break the sort of vicious cycles that Fernando also mentioned in his PowerPoint. Okay, Fer, I would like to give you kind of the opportunity to briefly kind of comment on this kind of wonderful interventions from our speakers. And then we've already started gathering some questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to continue kind of writing them down, and we'll post them to the speakers.
First of all, thanks a lot. I think that there is a lot of things to reflect. At first, and a very short note on the dynamics of the debt in the Ghana case. What I was referring in the presentation was the debt stabilizing primary balance, but on the debt dynamics, we include all the things that you, Amin, said. I mean, the primary surplus, the cost of refinancing, the effect of the restructuring, all these kind of things are part of the dynamics of the debt. Second, and I think that this is, for me at least, I think that it's something that we should highlight when we talk about institutions. I think that we also need to talk about hardware, not just software. And public financial management systems are at the essence in mostly, as Amin said, in lower and middle income countries. I mean, most of the time we are making a lot of effort on passing bills, on fiscal rules and all these kind of things. But if the country doesn't have in place a good public financial management system, this is going to be very complicated. I mean, you cannot enforce almost anything if the data that you're using is not good. That doesn't work. And it's going to kill me about this, but as an Argentinian, I'm going to talk a little about my country. So because we had some views from other countries of the world, so let me take the liberty of give just a few comments that I think that are important for what we thought about both the role of the fiscal institutions, fiscal councils, and something about the fiscal rule. First of all, we don't have in Argentina fiscal council. We have a congressional office budget. And this is personal experience, but when I was a public official, it was honestly for us at the executive branch, a pain in it was very hard because they are basically, we will basically constantly need to defend our estimates against them, against their estimates of impact of, but there was a huge difference that they made their estimation public. And to be honest, even when for us it was very hard, it amazingly raised the quality of parliamentary and public debate on the budget and on any measure with fiscal costs. So that's where I think, in my view, what we are imagining on this kind of institutions, to try to bring the numbers, to say, okay, if you're going to do these kind of things, these are going to be the impact. This is problematic for the executive branch, but it's very important for fiscal policy in general. And maybe to give a reflection on Jeromin and trying to think on Argentina, I think that Argentina it's kind of the textbook case of making big commitments ex ante with little or very low deliver ex post. So when we talk about accountability and what I think why accountability matter is not just on what you are, which level of commitment you are making. it's how you're delivering policies all the time, and in which kind of direction. I think that we're not very good on saying countries, okay, you should need to make a plan for your government. For what are you going to do? For what are you going to respond against shocks? And what are going to be the consequences of that? I think, and this is, again, that we need to push more into countries into saying, okay, you need to make public your policies. That if you're going to use a discretion, and I think that the problem is that we cannot enforce against the abuse of discretion. But if you're going to use discretion, you need to be accountable. You need to make public the kind of risk that you're taking. In the case of Germany, for example, I think that they are taking a risk, that it's in the medium term, you might not have the growth that you were expecting, but they should make that public. We are making a bet in order to have a higher growth. If that doesn't happen, well, these are the risks. That's our idea on how to try to deal with this problem. So I will stop there, and maybe we can go to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So in the interest of time, I think I'll ask kind of the questions that we have in the chat now, and then kind of all of the speakers can kind of answer to them in a kind of final round of comments. If there are more questions that come in, please feel free to write them down, and we'll try to get to them. If we can't, then we'll make sure to kind of follow up after the webinar as well. The first question is to you, Amin. It's a question from Innocent, and the question is whether you can comment on the role of the IMF in the fiscal policy rule, and what effect it had on the government. I'm assuming kind of the kind of ability kind of to manage the fiscal policy and budgetary policies. Second question is, I think, for all of the speakers. A participant requires further kind of elaboration on effective fiscal councils in the Global South. What did it take for them to be effective? And kind of this, of course, asked in the context of capacity being a constraint in some of emerging markets and developing economies. We have a question from Martin Kessler, who is interested in knowing, in kind of hearing more about the problem of transparency and the ability to hide debt. Particularly, Amin, you mentioned risks to hide deficit through various techniques such as arrears, SOEs, etc. Highlighting again that this is not only the case in Ghana, but in many other countries, such as, for instance, in Greece, with the outright objective of going around EU rules. So the question is, how can fiscal councils help us overcome this? And whether it makes sense to finance some investments off budget, which can make debt rules even harder to enforce. And last but definitely not least, we have a question specifically about Argentina. And here the question is, what kind of, Fernando, your comments are in terms of what is essentially going on in Congress right now in terms of its implications for the budget as well, and budget expenditures with regards to health and education. Yeah, let me stop there. And maybe we can take the reverse order. So Jeromin, maybe you can start, and then we'll pass on the floor to Amin, Monica, and Fernando to close up.
So I actually think I will pass, because I don't think any of these questions was directed to me. Let me pass.
Okay, fair enough. Amin.
Well, so the role of IMF in the implementation of the fiscal policy rule. First of all, Ghana had a fiscal responsibility rule, which was just to use the overall fiscal balance on cash basis, not exceeding 5% GDP. That was the rule. And also to maintain a primary a surplus, a positive primary balance at all times. But unlike the overall fiscal policy, the overall fiscal balance, which was just the normal fiscal balance, we were not able to use it in addressing our debt crisis. And this is why I believe there is now a specific rigid quantitative target of primary fiscal balance on commitment basis. The essence of this is to be able to address issues relating to arrears accumulation and debt accumulation. So we have moved from the previous fiscal rule to a new one. Now, the IMF had a role to play in this because they somehow agreed with Ghana when Ghana decided to amend the fiscal rule, given that debt crisis had been our major problem, which our previous fiscal rule did not address, and thereby requested Ghana to submit a bill for the amendment of the fiscal rule to Parliament by October 2024. So in October 2024, we submitted the bill, a new fiscal responsibility bill, which also had in it an independent fiscal council. Unfortunately, Parliament did not pass before the parliamentary tenure expired. But the new government came in, and instead of representing the fiscal responsibility law or bill, decided to rather amend the Public Financial Management Act to include, fiscal responsibility rules, as well as the need to establish the fiscal council. So the IMF really played a significant role. They also provided technical input to the development of the bill. And to that extent, I can say they were very, very useful. But going forward, it has to be Ghanaians who will implement this policy, particularly if Ghana exits the IMF program, or if the IMF program comes to an end by middle next year. The IMF will not be there to cite it as a conditionality. But we are committed to terms of debt restructuring that requires Ghana to continue to do well on the macro, even when Ghana leaves the IMF program at the end of its expiry. And therefore, we will have to be aware that investors are going to be watching, development financial institutions are going to be watching, the market generally, both in Ghana and abroad, will be watching. And above all, the citizens of Ghana, who will have to hold the government accountable to ensure that the laws that are made by their representatives, Parliament, are obeyed, are followed by the government. So this is what I can say about the role of the IMF. The IMF also will continue to complement the work of our fiscal council, because they will be doing the Article 4, analysis, surveillance, and other related reports the IMF will be issuing. And to the extent that they issue reports that are adverse to the implementation of the rules, it will reinforce the work of the fiscal council and therefore hold the government more accountable to the implementation of the fiscal rules. Now, coming to the role of the fiscal council in ensuring we do not accumulate arrears, that is very significant, because the fiscal council will do the analysis and they will publish the extent to which the minister does not meet the targets. If you accumulate arrears which lead to a breach of the quantitative targets of the rules, the minister will be sanctioned. The law provides that where the minister breaches either the primary balance rule or the debt rule twice by more than 1% for 2 consecutive years, the minister has to face a vote of censure in Parliament. And Parliament could, pass that vote, which requires the president to remove the Minister for Finance from his office. And so, if the minister does not ensure that arrears do not accumulate, the minister will suffer the consequences. But what is significant also about this law is that it's not only the Minister for Finance who will be held responsible, but the various ministers and in the various ministries and departments and agencies whose actions, and as I mentioned earlier in my earlier submission, it is their actions committing government on the blind side of the Ministry of Finance. Now, they also will be held responsible. They also will be sanctioned as per the Public Financial Management Act. Now, the problem, though, is whether government has the political will to sanction its ministers, removing its ministers and putting its ministers before trial when they violate the rules. That is what we need to really work on. And I think that with greater awareness among the citizens, the government will gradually come to the terms with the fact that when ministers are breaching, they must face the consequences.
Thank you so much, Amin. Monica, I'll pass on the floor to you.
Thanks. I have two brief points. One, I think, pertains to Martin Kessler's question or follow-up question on investment and debt rules. The question itself brought to my mind the issue of public banks, which we haven't talked about much, but which are very relevant because in a lot of the countries that we think about, especially in the global South, but in Europe as well, many of them have public banks. And oftentimes these public banks are development banks, and they have mandates to do certain things, which often do come into conflict with the fiscal framework that you have in place. And often it comes into conflict with debt rules and debt trajectories in the longer term. So this is an issue, and I don't think this is an issue that has been adequately resolved in any context. The context that I know best, which is the Brazilian one, is one where basically the National Development Bank, BNDES, is pretty much free or has free reign to do a lot of things which will be done and have been done in the past outside of this broader fiscal framework. And that creates problems. It created problems for Brazil 10 years ago, leading to the impeachment of a president. So, these problems can be very severe. So that was one point. And then the second point on the question regarding fiscal councils in the global South, I was a member of Brazil's Fiscal Council Advisory Board. So the Fiscal Council in Brazil has this setup. It's small. It's only a few people, and it has this structure with an advisory board. And at the time, I thought, this is great. It works really well. We are able to sort of signal precisely how we are seeing the fiscal situation unfold. But what has always been lacking and continues to be an issue, and you have flagged this in your report, is the broader governance structure. I mean, the Fiscal Council is a very key pillar to this broader governance structure, but it alone cannot be responsible for governance, broadly speaking. And that is usually the problem that we see, and that is usually the problem that we run up against. And I don't really see how we resolve that, especially when we have these very complicated political economy issues running in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That very much connects with also kind of Jeromin's last point on kind of the importance of kind of multiple layers of institutions, I think. Fernando, you have the last word.
I think that I need to talk about Argentina. Okay, I think that we can think this at different angles, but I think that the first point is that debt sustainability is not only about fiscal deficits or surplus. Not only, I mean, so I think that Argentina is giving a very good example of that. The current concerns about debt sustainability are more on the repaying capacity and not necessarily about fiscal deficit, but rather on the inability of the government to have a credible exchange rate regime and accumulate reserves. So simply running fiscal surpluses is not enough if a more broad macro program is not in place. So, and this is the second point. Markets also concerns about politics. So fiscal policy is not just a technical exercise. It's not just saying, okay, I'm going to put the primary surplus at 1.5 because it requires a broad political support. So, and this is another example from Argentina. The government implemented has a more than 1.5 primary surplus, but with which kind of policy? A tax reduction, an increase in public services, tariffs, and cutting public investment. The country is now is not growing. You alienate political allies, and it leads to electoral losses, and the market is concerned. So these trade-offs are part of the economic policy. I mean, what if you have a lower primary surplus, but you build a better political support? Is that better for debt sustainability in practice or not? So these kind of problems are going to be part of the policy. That's why we basically are saying this cannot be built in a mechanical way. You need to think about it. This is economic policy. It needs to be granular. It needs to have a view. So I think that the Argentinian case, it gives also a very valid experience for that too.
Thank you so much, Fer. Let me maybe end kind of also commenting that last kind of part and quoting Monica by saying that we very much hope that this conversation contributed a little bit to avoiding political economy black holes in the future, which we really do not want and want to avoid. And we're, of course, very keen to continuing this conversation through our publications, kind of events, and very much engaging with the audience as well that connected and stayed with us until the end. So thank you so much for the speakers and look forward to connecting soon again.